That was the ABA, it was the times, think about the late 60s and early 70s, the fashions of the time. Here's this ABA with this red, white, and blue ball and a three-point shot that changed the way the game was played, up-tempo basketball, not too much concern about defense, just trying to outscore each other. The music and everything that was kind of earmarking the late 60s, early 70s, that factored into the ABA, and the fans were reading it up. So, yeah, you had a player who was a bar owner. You had players with huge afros. In Miami, you had the ball girls wearing bikinis. You had all kinds of weird promotions, things that people wouldn't even conceive of today. But, yeah, that was all pretty typical of the ABA.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, everybody. How you doing? It's Tim Hanlon, your humble and congenial host yet again for another fun-filled episode of Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast journey into what used to be in professional sports. Thank you so much for putting us in your earbuds again, and we hope to titillate and amaze and entertain you with some fun conversation around a league that we need to spend more time on, and that's the ABA, the American Basketball Association. Yes, the bouncing red, white, and blue ball and all from 1967 until 1976, arguably one of the most colorful and just all-and-out wacky leagues ever to grace the American sports landscape. And today's guest is our friend Mark Montieth, and we are going to spend a good hour and change talking about arguably one of the most successful teams in the ABA, and frankly, since then, one of the only four teams that made the merger transfer into the NBA in 1976, that being the Indiana Pacers. I learned a lot in this conversation. You will too. And the reason why Mark is especially interesting is because he's just authored, wait for it, a book. Yes, it came out a couple of months ago about the early days, the formative years, and the first couple of seasons of the Indiana Pacers in their ABA journey. The book is called Reborn, the Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis. And it's a dynamite read. It's chock full of direct interviews and statistics and some never-before-seen photos. And Mark's a guy who knows just about everything there is to know about the Pacers. Not only is he an Indianapolis native, but he has been a longtime sports writer for the Indianapolis Star, was a beat reporter for the Pacers for a good 12 to 15 years or so during the 90s and the Reggie Miller days. And of course, like many in the Indianapolis area, as a kid, became smitten with the Pacers in their ABA days, going to games and dreaming about what it might like to be actually to cover this team as a professional journalist as an adult. And sure enough, that's what he became. That's what he did. And that's what we're going to be talking about today in our conversation with Mark Montieth in just a couple of seconds about the early days of the ABA's Indiana Pacers. Before we get to our conversation with Mark, I want to say hello and thank you to our brand new sponsor. Yes, sportshistorycollectibles.com is that sponsor. And look, if you're looking for some fun and interesting and collectible memorabilia from some of the teams and the leagues that we talk about on this here very show, then sportshistorycollectibles.com is the place to peruse. You will see plenty of items with new stuff just about every week from all the sports that we talk about and then some, both leagues current and no longer with us, right? So it's hockey, basketball, you name it, soccer, baseball, football, some tennis in there. There's Olympic stuff in there, you name it. Sportshistorycollectibles.com has got some really cool stuff, and I urge you to check it out. I think our listeners will especially find it to be a treasure trove, not only of history and nostalgia, but frankly, some stuff that you too can take home for yourselves. And as a special promotional offer, if you use the promo code GOODSEATS at checkout, you'll get 15% off your purchase. That's sportshistorycollectibles.com. Use the promo code GOODSEATS for 15% off your purchases at our new friends, our new sponsor, sportshistorycollectibles.com. Give them a try. Tell them we sent you, and I am sure that you will enjoy it. And our thanks to our friend Dean Mitchell, the proprietor of said site, and hopefully we'll have a few more fun promotional offerings in the weeks and months to come. Again, it's sportshistorycollectibles.com. Thank you, Dean, and thank you, friends, for checking it out. We appreciate it. All right, so let's segue into our interesting conversation, our chat with longtime Indianapolis sports writer, a beat reporter, and author, Mark Montieth, and our conversation about the Indiana Pacers of the old ABA.
I grew up in Indianapolis, and I was 12 years old when the ABA was formed in 1967. So, 12 years old is kind of a golden age for being a sports fan, I think. You're old enough to understand what's going on and read the newspapers or whatever, but naive enough, to not be aware of what might be going on behind the scenes, that kind of thing. That's kind of an age when you can kind of idolize athletes, I think. So, I was a big fan. I went to some of the games that first season. I played high school basketball, so, I was in love from the game. I'm one of the typical Hoosiers, I guess, who grew up going to high school games when I was 5 and 6 years old and watching the state tournament on television. So it was always a big deal for me. And when Indianapolis got a professional team, well, that was just tremendous, a whole nother level of basketball to follow here. And was interested in becoming a newspaper sports writer when I was 12, 13 years old. If you had asked me what I wanted to do, that would have been my answer. And I got a journalism degree from Indiana University and got newspaper jobs starting out in Marion, Indiana, and then Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then moved to Indianapolis and still worked for the Fort Wayne paper. And then later got a job with the Indianapolis Star. So I covered the Pacers for 12 years as a beat writer, which is actually a record for the Star. Nobody else has done it that long. And I'm kind of proud of that because it's a grind of a job. And then I also, though, covered a lot of games and was around a lot before and after I was a beat writer. So, I go back to the first year of the Pacers and have kind of been on top of things almost all the way through their existence. And now, I consider myself a freelance writer. I write for Pacers.com, their website, mostly as a feature writer, columnist type of thing, and have just written the book as well, Reborn, the Pacers and the Return to Pro Basketball to Indianapolis, which covers the formation of the franchise in the first 2 seasons. So that's where I am today.
So obviously, in many respects, almost a dream come true, right? Becoming a beat reporter for a team that you sort of fell in love with as a kid, dovetailing with your interest in being a journalist. What sort of tickled your fancy enough that beyond sort of the daily grind of covering this at the time, then obviously a successful NBA franchise, it convinced you to sort of go back and sort of rewind and go back some to the early days and the formative days of the franchise when it was a fledgling member of this new upstart American Basketball Association?
Yeah, I wrote a book in 1988 on Purdue's basketball season called Pass and Play, which was a successful book, and that was an inside account of their season that year when they won the Big Ten. I had total access to the program, to the coaches' meetings, the locker room. I was on the bench during games and so forth. And after that experience, although I was burned out for a while, I wanted to do another book. And my thought then, this is in the early 90s, like around 1990, I thought, I should do a book on the ABA Pacers because I'd, gone to a lot of those games. I knew how exciting it was for the city. I knew what it meant for the city. And that was my first idea. And then as I began researching, I began learning about the teams before the Pacers, going all the way back to the early 30s. The first, in my mind, real pro basketball team in Indianapolis was the Kautzkis, which was owned by a grocery store owner, Frank Kautzky. And Johnny Wooden played for him beginning in 1932, and they lasted up till the late 40s. And they evolved into the Jets, and they evolved into the Olympians. And in the early 90s, those guys are still alive. I interviewed a lot of those guys. and got their stories. And I got to think, okay, I'll do something on the beginnings of pro basketball in Indianapolis all the way through the ABA years. Well, that's a long time period. And if you're going to get into any detail and tell the stories, we're talking like 1,000-page book or something. And, I didn't want to do that. So as time went on, I gathered more information. It narrowed to a focus of the formation of the Pacers and the first couple seasons when they got off the ground. My book is 400 pages, and it really deals with the events leading up to the formation of the franchise, how it came together, and how they got it off the ground, all the things that had to happen for them to survive their first couple of years.
All right, well, let's get
it just kind of evolved that way.
Yeah, let's get into that because that's red meat for this little here podcast. And we did a previous episode with our friend Murray Nelson in episode 34 about the National Basketball League, in which we delve into some of those formative years which the Koetskis were part of, and the industrial leagues that kind of sort of preceded it as well. So that's a good listen for those who are interested in this topic and want to go a little bit further back. But perhaps maybe you can enlighten us into what the sort of state of Indiana and the sport of basketball, the sort of dramatic love affair that sort of exists, and then maybe we can sort of slide into those years that existed, or those years that did not exist, I guess, professionally with the sport of basketball after the Olympians folded in 1953. And the beginnings of the Pacers in 1967. It's a big chunk of time to not have a professional franchise in a basketball mad state. No?
Yes. Yeah. The Olympians for a brief time were really popular. They played at Butler Fieldhouse, and they drew big crowds because they had a really good team, and they had two players, Ralph Beard and Alex Groza, who would probably be in the Hall of Fame today, but they were banned from pro basketball because they had participated in a scandal at the University of Kentucky, particularly Groza. They took money from gamblers. I think the truth is that Groza did influence the outcome of games. Beard did not, but he took money from Groza, sent it home to mom, so he was implicated, and they were both banned from the NBA. So the Olympians, a year or two later, fold because they're not very good and they're stained. So for 14 years, Indianapolis did not have pro basketball. So the landscape was high school basketball, which was huge in the 50s and 60s. The state tournament was a really big deal then, and that's really how I fell in love with it, watching the state tournament on television. You had Oscar Robertson coming out of Indianapolis. You had the whole Bobby Plump and Milan story, which led to the movie Hoosiers. You had great moments, but it was high school basketball and Butler University. And Butler had a good program, and they would play a good schedule. And it seemed like every year they might knock off a Big Ten team, Michigan State, IU, or Purdue. So that's kind of what it was. It was high schools in Butler if you were living in Indianapolis. And that really wasn't enough as the city was growing and growing throughout the 60s. And there was an effort going on to get a major league franchise of some kind in Indianapolis, whether it was going to be basketball, baseball, football, something. There was just a dedicated group of local people, local leaders who were trying to do that. The Cincinnati Royals were coming over about one game a year throughout the late 50s and 60s to play a game because Oscar Robertson, Indianapolis' own, was on the Royals. So they would come over and play a game at the Fairgrounds Coliseum and draw pretty well. One year they lost to the Lakers with Jerry West and Elgin Baylor in a game in which the Lakers clinched the Western Division championship. And it's funny, growing up here, I wasn't aware of those. I'm wondering, how did I not know these games, these NBA games were going on at the Coliseum? I must have seen it in the paper, but it didn't stick with me. And I'm wondering, why didn't Dad take me to those games? So it was, there was like one game a year going on, and they drew pretty well. And it was too expensive, though, for anyone here to get an expansion franchise. Too expensive to get a team like the Royals to move, although there were conversations about that. So it wasn't until the ABA was formed that it became affordable enough for anyone here to buy a franchise.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You'd think that the NBA would have tried to, or the powers that be would have tried to figure it out some kind of way aside from sort of borrowing the Cincinnati Royals for a game or two, given just how just deep and rich and rooted the sport of basketball is and was around the state.
Yeah. Yeah, Fort Wayne had a franchise. Anderson had even had a franchise in the late 40s, early 50s. So, pro basketball had been in Indiana. But, the Olympians had left a stain. The NBA kind of was, for a while, looked down on because of that, the way it ended for them. And there just wasn't enough financial support for getting a team. Even a couple of years after the Olympians folded, there was still talk about, can Indianapolis get another team? It's a good market. The Olympians drew well. But nobody either had the money or the interest to do that here. And as the NBA grew, it became more and more expensive. By the mid to, like in 66, 67, when the Chicago Bulls came in and then Seattle Supersonics, it cost, $1 million or more to buy an expansion franchise into the NBA. And nobody here was either able or willing to come up with that. So people were just kind of stuck. And there was talk with the Royals about, maybe the Royals can play half their games in Indianapolis, but that was a bad idea. You have to have a home. You can't, these teams that tried to have regional locations like they did in the ABA, in North Carolina and other places, it doesn't work. You got to have one major city that you play out of. And so it's good that they didn't try to split time with the Royals, but it was only because the ABA, made franchises available for $6,000 down payment and then $30,000 check. That's the only reason Indianapolis was able to get into the game.
All right, well, let's talk about some of that, right? So we're now sort of circa late 1966 or so, and the rumblings of this sort of renegade challenger to the staid and somewhat dowdy and dark and dank National Basketball Association was running all around, and the idea was called the American Basketball Association. Perhaps you can rewind us back to sort of that time generally, and then more particularly the sort of how the Indianapolis entry sort of came into being.
Yeah, in 1966, you have to remember the AFL was succeeding. The AFL began in 1960 and grew and forced a merger with the NFL. And they officially merged, I think it was in 1970, but they had agreed to a merger before that. So I think that planted the seed for some people. Well, maybe a second basketball league could succeed because there was a market for one. There were only 9 NBA teams through the 60s, and some major markets did not have a team. And there were some really good college players, first-team college All-Americans coming out, unable to make an NBA franchise because there just weren't that many jobs available. Veteran players were hanging on to their jobs, and the new guys coming in weren't finding places to play. So the major reason the ABA succeeded as long as it did was that there was a market for it. There was a need for it. So in 1966, a couple different people kind of came up with the idea simultaneously of starting a new league. I think one in California, one in New York. And they start nosing around, and they knew of Indiana's reputation as a basketball mecca, and they're contacting people here. I found a letter in September of 66 that was written to John DeVoe, who was one of the local leaders who was trying to get something going in Indianapolis, saying, we'd like to talk to you about this new league. And DeVoe's initial response was, well, look, I can't really help you because, this city doesn't support minor league endeavors very well. I don't think it would work, but keep in touch, as you go along here, let's stay in touch. And as time went on, DeVoe realized these guys were serious. They were having meetings. They were getting with George Mikan. He had agreed verbally to be the commissioner. They just kept going. They came to town and met with people. They were showing real serious interest in forming a new league. And really the birth of the Pacers, if there's going to be one singular event, would have been a dinner at a country club in Lafayette, Indiana, about an hour north of Indianapolis, where Purdue University is located. A man up there named Len Treese hosted an annual big game dinner where they would serve elk and bear and all kinds of exotic meats, I guess. And a couple guys from Indianapolis went to that. One of them, Bob Collins, sports editor of the Indianapolis Star. He was probably the most powerful media figure in the state at the time. He went up with a local promoter, a guy named Bob Young, to this dinner, and they're sitting around a table, And Collins is talking about, there's these guys who have been coming around town trying to start a new league called the ABA, and there's going to be a meeting in New York coming up before long. It's only going to take $6,000 to put dips on a franchise, and they're talking, no doubt drinking, and it basically came down to, well, let's do it. Let's try this. And Joe Bannon, who was a banker in Lafayette, went to that meeting. I think he was planning to go to New York on business anyway. He went to that meeting and put down the money, and lo and behold, suddenly Indianapolis was recognized as a member of the American Basketball Association.
That's crazy. It almost seems like it's a lost or a won, drinking bet, in a card game or something like that.
Yeah, I could only imagine. I talked to Collins about that meeting, and I talked to one of the other people who was at the meeting. There were 3 Lafayette investors, one of them Henry Ebershoff. And I talked with him. I really wish I could have gotten to Joe Bannon. He died in 2006, and I consider that a failure of mine not to get with him before he died. But, it was just kind of a casual thing, sitting around the table in Lafayette. Why would 3 guys in Lafayette want to invest in a pro basketball team in Indianapolis? But they did, because it only took $1,000 a piece. It was basically, my understanding, half a dozen guys kicking in $1,000 a piece to get a franchise.
Do you think they were
this new league?
Do you think they were surprised that they actually were chosen, or perhaps that? So it happens now. What I mean, okay, so they were successful. Now they got to actually put it together.
Yeah, I think I don't think they were surprised. I think they were committed to trying to see it through. So there's a big article in the paper. I think it's early February of '67 that Indianapolis member of new pro basketball loop, the ABA. Up until then, nobody had heard of it. Suddenly, there's a big press conference in New York. George Mikan is there. He's going to be the new commissioner, although he hasn't signed a contract yet. And this new league is introduced, and there's going to be teams in Indianapolis and Pittsburgh and Anaheim, different places. Some cities were announced as having franchises that did not wind up having franchises, but, this new league is formed. And so, this group in Indianapolis is formed, investors are gathered, and the next big step is a meeting in New Orleans a month or so later where, okay, now it's serious. You've got to put a check in for $30,000 to have a franchise. This is how we're going to fund the league's operation. We got to pay the commissioner. They finally agreed to a contract with George Mikan. That was the first step of the meeting in New Orleans. And then franchises had to commit to each sending a check later by a certain date for $30,000. You're either in or you're out. And, that's when Kansas City dropped out. I think Denver suddenly came up with a franchise. Louisville at the last minute came up with a franchise. Milwaukee tried to get in and wasn't able to, but 11 cities came in to form the American Basketball Association there in 1967, no doubt with the plan and hope that, hey, within a couple of years, we'll force this merger with the NBA and the value of the franchises will skyrocket and we'll have a great investment. And that obviously didn't happen, but I'm sure that was in the back of their minds. But, it took that was the big moment where you had to seriously commit and not only send that check for $30,000, but, okay, you got to find an office. You got to get a staff. You got to accumulate a roster somehow. There's a lot of expenses that go with it. So that's when it became serious.
Based on your research, do you feel pretty confident that either the Pacers organization or what became the Pacers organization or the other sort of league founders and or franchise folks successful getting a franchise, that they already had merger sort of glimmer in their eye? To knowing that would be sort of the end result, or do you think that's more hindsight than anything?
Yeah, hard to say. I gotta believe that was their hope, because it's hard to start a new league. The ABL, as you're aware, had been in existence for a year and a half in the early '60s, folded at the end of December the second year, so they knew that. So I gotta believe that was the hope. It was going to be hard to compete against the NBA. So I got to believe they felt like we'll get some players and get some of the best players out of college and force that merger. It was never stated. But early on, the intention of the ABA owners, at least publicly, was we're not going to steal players from the NBA or try to sign their players away. We just want to get these kids out of college and build a new league. It seemed like they were trying to make nice with the NBA. Didn't take long before, Oakland stole Rick Barry from the NBA. Other players were signed away from the NBA. That was bound to happen. But I think I just have to believe logically that at the beginning, the ABA owners were thinking, we just got to hang in there for a couple, 3 years, and then we could merge with the NBA.
Well, and clearly a recognition that there was more talent out there than just the NBA could itself handle, and a bunch of other areas around the country where there wasn't, that was not lucky enough to have an NBA franchise that could possibly support the pro game, and obviously, as you mentioned, the AFL and the WHA was a couple of years away from that. The NHL was finally looking at expansion westward. So it seems like there was some real understanding going on in the major sports world that there were other markets and other untilled soils out there, shall we say, to actually build and grow a sport.
Yeah, no question. Think about it. Dallas did not have an NBA team. Houston did not have one. New Orleans, Denver. Those are bigger markets than Indianapolis. Indianapolis and then Louisville got one. Miami got a team the second year of the ABA, not the first. Pittsburgh, got an ABA team at the beginning, although it didn't last long. So, yeah, you're talking major markets that should be able to support a pro basketball team. Some of these cities had hockey, some did not, but it just seemed like the timing was right. The 60s were a time when people were trying things, and taking chances, that type of thing, and showing a flair for trying something in a different way. So this seemed like it all came together at the right time to form a new league.
All right, so before we get into the actual first year, what about that sort of major issue about naming the actual franchise, right? The nickname Pacers, and I think actually, if I'm not mistaken, there was real debate between whether to call them Indianapolis or Indiana Pacers.
Well, not really debate. No, they came out at the very beginning. When they announced the franchise, they said right away, we're Indiana. The previous team, the Olympians and Kautzkis, they had been Indianapolis, and their uniform said Indianapolis. Although I think Olympians just said Olympians. But no, they said from the beginning that we're Indiana. And I think their original intention was we're going to play games around the state. And in fact, the first year they played half a dozen games, home games in other locations, some of them at high school gymnasiums, if you can imagine pro basketball games being played at high school gymnasiums. But they were Indiana from the beginning because they wanted to be Indiana's team. But they came up with Pacers. It's kind of vague. There was a reference made at the press conference which announced the nickname, which is in June of '67, talked about, taking a fan poll, that type of thing, fans submitting suggestions. I never saw anything in a newspaper asking for fans to mail in a suggestion for a nickname. And nobody seems to remember that, but different people have claimed that they were the ones who came up with Pacers, including the first general manager, Mike Storm. I've talked to other people who say, oh, my mother did it, or this kind of thing. So it's very vague who exactly thought of Pacers. But it comes primarily from harness racing. The Pacers were to play at Fairgrounds Coliseum. Across the street from the Coliseum was a track, a harness racing track, also used for auto races, but primarily for harness racing. And a pacer is a type of harness racehorse. There's trotters and there's pacers. And so there's pacers. And it also related somewhat to the Indianapolis 500. Pacer is not an auto racing term, but you have the pace car. So it kind of fit together with that as well. So Mike Storm at the press conference said, we want to set the pace in basketball, in the American Basketball Association, that kind of thing. So in the newspaper articles announcing the nickname, nobody was given credit for thinking of it, but it was certainly primarily a reference to harness racing and then secondarily to auto racing.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. Did you get any indication in your research as this team, the formative months before the actual play began, that they would actually become arguably the most successful franchise in the ABA, and along with the Colonels of Kentucky, were the only teams to play in their same market for the entire duration of the league?
Yeah, there were indications. I think the city was hungry for it, and they, number one, they got great support in the newspapers. I mean, it would be unethical today to support a new endeavor the way the newspaper supported the Pacers. They were rah-rah about the whole thing. They covered everything. Bob Collins, the Star sports editor who helped bring the group together that financed the Pacers, he didn't have money in it. And I wouldn't say he was corrupt about it. But he certainly put out positive stories about this new team, and they wrote a lot about every guy they signed, and there were constantly stories in the paper, no skepticism whatsoever toward the Pacers, and that was true for the afternoon paper as well, and their sports editor, Wayne Fuson, by the way, whose son is now the president of the Pacers. So they got the newspaper support. They had an open tryout in June, where about 150 people either were invited or came off the streets to try out for the team. Slick Leonard, the longtime Pacer coach, was one of the people who kind of oversaw the tryouts along with Clyde Lovellette. And all these guys came out and thought they could be a pro basketball player. They weeded them out very quickly. And then they had these scrimmages, that week in June. I think it's the third week of June of '67, and 2,000 and 3,000 people were coming out for these scrimmages at the Coliseum and the different places. And I think that was the first indication that, man, people want to see something here. It's not like there were a lot of big name players in these scrimmages, not by any means. So that told you that there was great interest. And I think it just kind of went on from there throughout the summer. A lot of stories in the newspaper, kind of gave the fans interest, and just the fact that there was a real hunger in the city to have something so-called big time, it kind of all came together and made it work that first year.
How many, in that sort of tryout scenario, how many were truly local products? Because I know we're not going to get into the later years of the Pacers as much, but it did seem that some of the most successful players during the course of the Pacers' ABA run did indeed come from, either by happenstance or by design, from the great state of Indiana, either playing or having grown up there and played in high school and in college. I almost wonder if that was part of the plan, or maybe that was part of the ABA's plan too, to sort of have territorial rights for their franchises, or maybe you can give some enlightenment into that if you could.
Yeah, I think Mike Storm, the first GM, did make it a point to have some homegrown talent. Obviously, you want to sell tickets and you want to have players on your roster who will attract the fans. So really only a few players came out of that tryout, and they had been invited to the tryout. You had Jerry Harkness, who had been on Loyola's '63 championship team, come out of that tryout. He had written a letter and asked for a tryout. who bought Netolicky, who was drafted but did not have a guaranteed contract, came out of that tryout. There's a guy, Bobby Joe Edmonds, from Indianapolis, came out of that tryout. The first Pacer team was kind of a Big Ten all-star team. You had, players from about half the Big Ten teams on the original roster. You had, Jimmy Rail from IU, Matthew H. from Michigan State, Oliver Darden from Michigan, Ron Kozlicki from Northwestern, Jimmy Dawson from Illinois. you were having guys who had success in college from the Big Ten conference, where at least people knew who they were if you had followed college basketball. Ron Bonham from Indiana, Mr. Basketball, in 1960, was on that first roster. He had played a couple of years with the Celtics, so he had some experience. Was an All-American in college. You had three guys. You had Bobby Joe Edmonds, who came out of high school in Indiana in 1959 on a state championship team. Jimmy Rail was Mr. Basketball in 1959. Ron Bonham was Mr. Basketball in 1960. The last player cut from the first Pacer team was Larry Humes, who was Mr. Basketball in 1962, and by the way is now an usher at Pacer games in his retirement. Jimmy Rail was an IU. Rail went on to graduate from IU in '63. So you had those guys for local flavor. So between a few state high school players and some Big Ten college players, they put together a roster with a lot of recognizable names.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it seems almost masterful, right? In that, you've got a state that's been sort of basketball mad for many, many years. It almost feels almost more homegrown that way, not in terms of not only the players, but also sort of attaching themselves to the fans to get invested, if you will, into this team from the get-go. And I can't think of a better reason why than to sort of continue to root on some of their favorite hometown heroes.
Right, no question. The best players on the first team were not from Indiana, so we'll talk later, but they certainly had an element there of guys who contributed and helped attract fans out to the game. Probably the biggest name on the first team was Jimmy Rail going into it, having been Mr. Basketball and a high scorer, and then having played at Indiana. Although he had been out of college for 4 years when the ABA was formed, he had been playing AAU ball in Akron, Ohio for the Goodyear team. Still a big name, and he didn't come out of the tryout. He was signed to a non-guaranteed contract after that initial tryout. But he was probably the biggest name. He wasn't the starter that first year most of the time, but still a name, and there were a few other guys who were names as well.
Yeah, that also was interesting. And also, similarly, you had the first, I believe, actual signing of the team was another AAU player, the name of Roger Brown. But that's an interesting story because Roger Brown, otherwise known as the Raja, had been blacklisted from the NBA. Maybe you can get into some of the background there and why Brown was so high on the draft board for the Pacers in their first ever ABA draft.
Yeah, Roger Brown was one of the great players to come out of New York City and had gotten to Dayton, University of Dayton, as a freshman. But he, kind of like Ralph Beard for the Olympians in the early 50s, was implicated in gambling. Roger Brown knew a guy named Jack Molinas, who was a gambler and a fixer of college basketball games. And Molinas made it a point to get to know the great high school players to establish a relationship with them. So he would buy lunch for guys like Roger Brown and Connie Hawkins. He might loan them his car. He'd find these poor kids out of the ghetto in a city like New York and befriend them and do favors for them and establish a relationship. So Brown knew this guy, but he was a high school kid. He wasn't shaving points. He maybe people bought him lunch or whatever, but he wasn't on the take. But he went to Dayton, played as a freshman when freshmen were not eligible for varsity competition, and then was banned by the NBA and NCAA, which is amazing to think about now. But it was really a politically motivated thing. You had people wanting to be district attorneys who were trying to be tough on crime and make an example of people, and Roger Brown got caught up in that. So he stayed in Dayton. He came from just absolute poverty, Brooklyn. When he gets blacklisted, he stays in Dayton, moves in with an older couple, and works for General Motors. He's working night shift in a General Motors factory. But he, in the summers, would play AAU games and just go to the playgrounds and would wind up playing with some members of the Cincinnati Royals, including Oscar Robertson. So when the Pacers were formed, their first thought for a coach was to get Oscar Robertson to be a player coach. And they made him, they got together and came up, they're going to offer him about $100,000 to be a player coach and use of a car. And there were all kinds of perks they were trying to throw together to lure Oscar Robertson back to Indianapolis to be a player coach for the Pacers, because he was a free agent at the time with the Royals. Oscar really just kind of used that interest to help his negotiation with the Royals, but the Pacers were interested. But Roger told them, look, go get Roger Brown. Oscar had played with him. There's a guy named Roger Brown. I played with him. He's really good. Go get him. And lo and behold, Mike Storn, he claims that the day he signed his contract to be the GM, drove right to Dayton and talked to Roger Brown. And Roger was married. His wife was a nurse. They were doing okay. He had a good factory job, and she was a nurse, and they were getting by just fine. Both working night shift. And the Pacers come calling, and Roger Brown naturally is skeptical, not very trusting of authority figures, and some guy shows up on its doorstep and is making this offer to come join this new team in the new league. But they went for it. They had nothing to lose. They lined his wife up with a nursing job in Indianapolis, and for what I'm told, he was told by the people at the factory that, look, if it doesn't work out, you can come back and get your job back. So they felt like they had nothing to lose and moved to Indianapolis. And what's kind of funny looking back is that the Pacers never announced they had signed Roger Brown. They, I think, were really worried about Emmys. They didn't want to put out word that, we just signed this guy who got banned from the NBA. Can't play college ball either, nobody would have been impressed by that. Wasn't going to sell tickets. So Roger came to those initial tryouts and really stood out. He did not have a guaranteed contract either, is my understanding. And the first time his name appeared in the paper was out of these tryouts in June, where people were saying, Roger Brown's really good. He stood out. And nobody knew who Roger Brown was, but that's when he first kind of came to the attention of the general public. So the Pacers got lucky in a lot of different ways those first few years, and couldn't have possibly gotten luckier than to get a future Hall of Fame player out of a factory in Dayton, Ohio.
Yeah, according to my notes, he was the first ABA player, the first career ABA player to be nominated and inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame.
Yeah, he was. Yes, he was. And, he was a great talent. By today's standards, with today's media, he'd be criticized a lot for inconsistent effort, that type of thing. He wasn't the guy to dive on the floor for a loose ball. He would publicly admit that he would coast a bit until the playoffs when it was money time. Even when money wasn't big. In the early years of the ABA, he would talk about this is money time. But he was a hugely skilled player, a great clutch player, and the kind of guy when you got to know him, you really liked him. All of the teammates I've talked with just really liked Roger a lot, even though he was kind of aloof with people he didn't know. So just a huge break for the Pacers, and, really a huge break for Roger Brown. He would have lived out his life working in a factory in Dayton, Ohio, if it wasn't for the formation of the ABA.
And he became the all-time leading scorer and player with minutes played for the Pacers during their franchise history. So it's a pretty interesting. All right, so who's Larry Staverman is the name of the head coach. You mentioned before a guy we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, Slick Leonard. But the first coach of the Pacers was not Leonard. It was this guy named Larry Staverman. What about him? Why was he named? Where'd he come from? Any background on him?
Yeah, he had been an assistant coach at Notre Dame for a couple of years. He had played in the NBA, had played in the ABL, so had some pro basketball experience, and then had become an assistant coach, Johnny D, at Notre Dame. He was not the first choice by any means. Again, Oscar Robertson was the first choice to be a player coach, but it didn't take long for the people in Indianapolis to realize Oscar's really not serious about this. We can't wait on him. We are going to go out and find a coach. They talked to Ed Jucker, who had coached Cincinnati to 2 national titles in the early 60s and was out of coaching at the time, doing broadcasting in Cincinnati. He was a big name. He wound up that same year taking the Royals head coaching job claiming he wanted to do, even though Indianapolis had made him a better offer, he wanted a major league job. He called it major league. So he turned down the Pacers. They talked to a guy named Jim Holstein, who was the coach at St. Joseph's College in Rensselaer, Indiana, who had played briefly in the NBA. Mike Storm was looking for people with some professional experience, some NBA experience, and Holstein was a successful small college coach, but he wasn't going to risk a stable college job for this new league that, might not last even through the first year. So they never came to agreement, never had a serious negotiation. They weren't willing to give him like a 3-year guaranteed contract or anything like that. So that didn't work out. I think they made inquiries to some other people. George King, who was the coach of Purdue, his name came up. He had played in the NBA, was doing well at Purdue, but I don't think there was anything serious there. So it came down to Larry Staverman. And Staverman was recommended by Slick Leonard because Slick had coached Staverman in Chicago with the Zephyrs. And then Mike Storm, the first GM, was a Notre Dame alum, a proud Notre Dame alum. So he, no doubt, had contacted Johnny D for recommendations. Maybe, I don't know, he might have even asked D if he wanted to coach the team. And D recommended Staverman. So signs started pointing toward this Larry Staverman guy who had pro experience as a player and had 2 years of coaching experience at Notre Dame. And he was announced as the head coach in June of 1967 at the same press conference in which the Pacers announced their nickname.
And not a bad first season, right? You had a team that almost was 500. They started out of the right out of the gate. They were 5-0 on their in their first number of games, and they wound up with a 38-40 record, good enough for third place in the Eastern Division. And they made the playoffs, maybe not too hard with 11 teams, but all in all, not a bad first season. I gather. Were there any sort of notable moments in that sort of first season? I guess either in terms of attendance, in terms of play, was there inconsistency? Staverman at least seems like he had a pretty good handle on the situation and his players.
Yeah, I mean, Staverman, to sum him up, was a knowledgeable coach and a really nice guy, not probably hard-nosed enough to coach pro athletes, but that was just his personality. You talk to his former players, he was a nice guy, but at the same time, don't admit that he wasn't tough enough. I mean, Jerry Harkness summed it up well when he said Staverman was the kind of coach you wanted to win for, but Slick Leonard was the kind of coach you did win for. So they got through the first season pretty well, and like you said, got off to a great start. That was primarily because Mike Storm had his act together, and the Pacers were just more organized than other teams. They had not only the open tryouts in June, but the guys that they kept from those tryouts practiced 2-3 nights a week, and throughout August, September, they had a real training camp in September, a really challenging training camp. So when the season began, their guys had been playing together a while, and they were in shape. And some of the other ABA teams were just kind of operating on the fly at that point, just trying to get their act together. So that helped the Pacers get off to a really good start. And like you said, they were 38-40 that first season. There were some notable moments, no question. Jerry Harkness, about a month into the season, hit an 88-foot game-winning three-pointer in Dallas at the buzzer. Just flung a shot from a few feet in bounds the length of the court and banked it in for a game-winning three-pointer, which for a long time was the longest shot in the history of pro basketball. Baron Davis actually years later hit one that was regarded as an 89-footer. But that was a big deal, and it was kind of typical of how things were going early on. Like everything was just going great. The fans were coming out, the team's winning, they're throwing in game-winning three-pointers at the buzzer. Everything was really going well. But as time went on, the rest of the league kind of caught up with the Pacers. And they did make the playoffs, but it became a struggle, and some cracks were forming that first year. Again, Staverman didn't totally have the respect of the players, didn't have command of the situation. They started playing as individuals for a while. Should probably mention that the Pacers did host the first ABA All-Star game. No league had ever had an All-Star game in its first year of existence. You can imagine how difficult that would be. But Mike Storm took on that challenge. They played it at Butler, took a lot of political wangling and a nice cash payout to get Butler to let the pros use its field house, because they were still mad about the Olympians experience and, being stained by that, their association with the Olympians. But they played the ABA All-Star game. The Pacers lost close to $30,000 on doing that, but it was great exposure for the league. I mean, the Pacers really took a hit there, but it got not really a national broadcast, but regional markets around the country. It got into New York and it got into LA and a lot of bigger cities. So a lot of people, the first ABA game they ever saw was that All-Star game, and it was a good game. And, Cliff Hagan, who had played in the NBA, was in it. Guys like Larry Brown and Mel Daniels and Roger Brown and Freddie Lewis and Bob Netolicky and, good players were in this game. Connie Hawkins. So it was a good show. And even though the Pacers took a bath, at least presented the league in a positive light. So that was crucial. I don't know if you want to get into the Reggie Harding story, but that was certainly quite a chapter for the Pacers.
Sure, let's hear it. Absolutely.
Okay. Reggie Harding, I mean, he would be just a great 30 for 30 documentary subject today if he were alive or if people who knew him were alive. He was a 7-footer out of Detroit, out of the streets, was basically drafted out of high school by the Pistons. He'd not gotten his degree in high school, but he went to this prep school or whatever you want to call it in Tennessee and then got drafted by the Pistons. He had to sit out a year to be eligible. He was a really promising 7-footer who, as a 22-year-old kid, was playing well against the likes of Chamberlain and Russell in the NBA. But he just did not have his act together. A guy from the streets, always late, always in trouble, all these petty crime issues, always got by because of, the fact he was a basketball player, always given second chances. But he played a few years for the Pistons. Wound up, they finally gave up on him, and he played a little bit for the Bulls. Then they gave up on him when he was missing practices and so forth. But the Pacers' first year, Bob Netolicky, the starting center, came down with mumps, and George Peoples, the backup center, had the flu. The Pacers were desperate for a center, and they signed Reggie Harding. They had, heard of him, probably didn't know the complete story of his background, but they signed him on a per-game contract. And he comes in and plays really well. Once he gets in shape and gets going, I mean, he is playing really well, outplaying Mel Daniels, the future Hall of Famer, in a couple of individual matchups. So things are looking up tremendously for the Pacers, and they're talking about the possibility of a championship season. They're beating Pittsburgh, the eventual champion. They're beating Minnesota, the second-best team in the league. But Reggie Harding keeps screwing up. They'll have a break in the schedule. He'll go home and not come back in time for practice. So he'll show up late for a game. It was always something. And finally, they suspended him before the playoffs. And so they played without him in the first round of the playoffs to Pittsburgh and got swept. So, it was, if not for that, again, that turned out to be lucky because that created the possibility of getting Mel Daniels. If Reggie Harding had finished that first season in good shape, the Pacers would have brought him back and never gone looking for another center. But he was just a great story because he was a nice guy. I got his autograph as a kid when I saw him at the airport one time. Everybody liked him, but everybody was just exasperated by him because he just kept screwing up. Coming from the streets of Detroit, never met his dad. Mom was an alcoholic, gave him up for adoption. Just a troubled kid, but a nice kid and a great talent. But he just never kept it together long enough. And after the Pacers let him go, he went back to Detroit and actually spent time in jail, seemed to be getting his life turned around after he got out of jail and wound up getting shot and killed by somebody in Detroit. So really a tragic story.
That is tragic. I maybe on the other end of the spectrum, though, you hinted at a sort of another player on that team and for a number of years on the team who also stood out for other reasons is Bob Netolicky, otherwise known as Neto. You want to kind of get into his little story there? He was quite the showman, quite the mod type player with the haircut.
Yeah,
ladies man.
Kind of the Joe Namath. Indianapolis is the answer to Joe Namath, I guess. Neto came out of Iowa. In fact, was once voted, and again, not too many years ago, voted the greatest player ever to come out of the state of Iowa. But he was a guy who only played 1 year of high school basketball, but by playing AAU games, got a scholarship to Drake and played at Drake and was good. But he was a flaky guy. His dad was a surgeon, so he grew up in a house with a lot of money, but didn't have a close relationship with his dad. And he just kind of roamed wild and free, driving a Corvette around town, brought in these exotic pets, ocelots and lions and snakes and all this kind of thing. Colorful guy in that regard. And he would play really well in college at times, but then he would get suspended for a game because he come late to practice, that kind of thing. Was always a headache for the coach. But for whatever reason, the Pacers drafted him in the third round of the very first ABA draft. And keep in mind, the first ABA draft was held just a couple of weeks after the Pacers hired their general manager. And all the ABA teams, nobody obviously had a scouting department. So these ABA teams kind of pooled all their information they could gather. They would read the college basketball magazines and rely on whatever institutional knowledge they had about college players and kind of pooled all their information at the first ABA draft, which was held in Oakland. And so the Pacers, for whatever reason, drafted Bob Netolicky in the third round. He's told me he had a guaranteed contract. My notes and information indicates otherwise. I can't say for sure, but he did make the team coming out of their tryout and hung on during training camp. Was just a gifted guy. He could run and jump. He could score. He had a hook shot. He had a mid-range jumper. He just had a lot of natural ability, and he was a highly intelligent guy, so he caught on to things quickly. But he was a flake in his own way. You had to kick him in the behind constantly to keep him motivated. And he was both a great asset as an all-star caliber player, but also a great headache for his coaches, who always had to try to come up with ways to motivate him.
And apparently a good bar owner, too. Netto's in the Meadows?
Yeah, for a couple of years, that was a hot spot in town. And believe me, Indianapolis didn't really have hot spots in that era. But this was the place where the Pacers would go after games and players from opposing teams would go after games. And it was kind of a popular hangout. It was in a shopping center called Netto's, and it was in the Meadow Shopping Center. So Netto's in the Meadows. And he had a red, white, and blue light looking like an ABA ball hanging out front. And a lot of guys would go there. And there's some stories that come out of Netto's in the Meadows. And I'll protect, like, for example, the Pacer player who wound up on the dance floor one night making out with this beautiful woman who turned out to actually be a man, a cross-dresser. That kind of story comes out of Netto's in the Meadows. And but it lasted for 2 or 3 years, and then he sold it and moved on. But for the people who were there, it remains kind of a colorful chapter in the city's history.
None of this, to any ABA fan, sounds in the least bit odd, right? These stories, these types of players, the personalities involved, the flakiness, all of it seems just right at home, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that was the ABA. It was the times. Think about the late 60s and early 70s, the fashions of the time. Here's this ABA with this red, white, and blue ball and a three-point shot that changed the way the game was played. Up-tempo basketball, not too much concern about defense, just trying to outscore each other. And, the music and everything that was, kind of earmarking the late 60s, early 70s, that factored into the ABA, and the fans were eating it up. So, yeah, you had a player who was a bar owner. You had, players with huge afros. You had all kinds of, you had in Miami, you had the ball girls wearing bikinis. You had all kinds of weird promotions, things that people wouldn't even conceive of today. But, yeah, that was all pretty typical of the ABA.
All right, before we get into that sort of second season, which is pretty much kind of the climax of your book and the focus of the conversation, maybe it's important to also step back and sort of give a sense of how the team was received in the community. You mentioned the Star and obviously its publicity efforts around it. But, the Coliseum, right? The Indiana State Fairgrounds, now known as the Indiana Farmers Coliseum and since long rehabbed, was not necessarily the, shall we say, the crown jewel of the ABA venues, right? And I get the sense that not only for the first season, but over the seasons that followed, became a source of contention and, I I don't want to say a mutual dislike, but certainly some real consternation, I guess, when it came to playing conditions and the future of the franchise going forward.
Yeah, the Coliseum, really didn't care whether a basketball team played there or not. The State Fair Board, which ran it, they were doing fine. They had all the events there related to the State Fair, and they would have other things there. They'd have concerts. The Beatles played at the State Fairgrounds in September of 1964, for example. So big name entertainers would go through there. So they were doing fine financially. They didn't really care that much about having an ABA team. They charged the Pacers a lot of money, more than other teams paid at the facility, and they weren't really, doing their job. They didn't keep the place clean. They didn't provide the things they were supposed to provide, the basic necessities. There was one time that first year when there was a Friday, Saturday back-to-back set of games at home, and they didn't even bother to clean it out after the Friday game. So people showed up for the Saturday game, and there's all this trash laying around the floors. I guess the Coliseum people figured they could save some money by waiting till after Saturday's game to clean it up. Things like that were going on. Mike Storn was constantly complaining about what they weren't doing, that things that were called for in the contract or just common sense things. The visitors' locker room was a joke. I'm told one shower head in there. The Pacer locker room was hardly luxurious. So very basic facility to play in. It smelled a bit because, during the summer you'd have barn animals in there. You could smoke at games back then, so you'd have this cloud of smoke hovering over the floor, which was true in every arena back then when you could smoke out in public. So it smelled, it was dark, it was dingy. But the people who went to the games have really fond memories of going to those games because of the atmosphere. But certainly by today's standards, it was a dump.
Well, okay, it didn't seem to stop the team from thinking enthusiastically about the next season. And I think there are two sort of seminal events, right, that sort of kind of defined that sort of second and championship finals playing team, one of which was this seemingly tremendous trade at the beginning of the season that brought in the aforementioned Mel Daniels. You want to sort of give a sense of sort of what was behind that?
Yeah. One of the great trades in the history of professional basketball, the most one-sided trade probably ever that I'm aware of. At the end of the Pacers' first season, like I mentioned earlier, the Pacers had suspended Reggie Harding. They were ready to give up on him. And at the same time, the Minnesota Muskies are moving. They did not draw well in Minnesota. And they need cash. They need to pay their franchise fee to the league. They're moving, so they don't care what the fans in Minnesota think about what they're doing, and the fans in Miami don't know what's going on yet. That's where they're moving to. So, long story short, the Pacers were able to convince them to sell them or trade them, Mel Daniels, for $100,000 and two players. Those two players were Ron Kozlicki and Jimmy Dawson, who had hardly played at all that first season. They were basically nobodies. They were throw-ins. I think the Pacers was just kind of lucky or happy to unload them. And $100,000. And it wasn't easy for the Pacers to come up with $100,000. One of the Lafayette investors, Len Treese, is given most of the credit for providing that money. He owned a bunch of Burger Chef fast food restaurants throughout the state of Indiana, so he had the money. And they got $100,000 to the owner of the Minnesota franchise, which is moving to Miami, and landed Mel Daniels, who had been the Rookie of the Year in the ABA that first season. Mel was the only player who was drafted in the first round of the NBA draft in 1967 who went to the ABA instead. All the other NBA first-round picks went to the NBA, and why not? Because who knows if this ABA deal is going to make it. But Mel got a better offer from Minnesota than he had gotten by the Royals. So he goes to the ABA, becomes Rookie of the Year, should have been MVP of that first ABA All-Star game, but the voting was taken too soon before he led a late comeback. So Larry Brown got MVP of the first ABA All-Star game, but Mel deserved it. So he was a great player, probably the second best center in the league behind Connie Hawkins, who was the MVP of the league that year. But nonetheless, a great talent out of New Mexico, where he had been I think a second or third team All-American. And the Pacers get him. And that's really what pushed it over the top. The Pacers had been a 38-40 team, and suddenly they bring in the Rookie of the Year to add to that mix. That was just absolutely huge. You could probably argue that the Pacers would not exist today if not for that trade, because if they had gone on being a 500 team and not winning championships, at some point the city probably gives up on them and they have to cease operations because they're not making any money, and then the city wouldn't have an NBA team today.
Well, and you'll see Mel Daniels' number 34, retired, hanging from the rafters of at current Pacer games. And in March of '69, he lit up the Nets for 56 points and 31 rebounds in one game. I mean, imagine. And he also became the MVP of the league that year. So it wasn't like he was any worse for the wear for not winning the MVP of that All-Star game. But let's also look at the first couple of games of that season, because despite having a firecracker in Daniels, the team did get off to a kind of a slow start and went 2-7 in their first 9 games, and a coaching change which would also affect the future trajectory of the team.
Yeah, that was the second big thing, which kind of ensured the survival of the franchise. Although the Pacers had Mel Daniels, Roger Brown, 2 future Hall of Famers, Freddie Lewis, an all-star guard, Bob Netolicky, an all-star forward. They have 4 all-stars on their roster, and they start out the next year 1-7. Things just weren't working under Staverman. They were losing close games, and it wasn't necessarily his fault. They were missing a lot of free throws, and it seemed like the attitude was okay, but it was not working. And the Pacers had a 3-game road trip out west. And the decision was made before the trip, but the decision was made to hire Slick Leonard before they went on that trip. Staverman's last game was the 3rd game of that trip in Los Angeles. And Mike Storin, the GM, told him the morning of the game, "I'm sorry, we have to let you go. It's your call whether you coach the game tonight or not. But we're just going to have to make a change." Staverman agreed to coach the game. He didn't say anything to his players about, "I've been fired." They went out and won the game. Los Angeles was a bad team anyway. It didn't take a lot to win the game, but they did go out and win the game. And Staverman didn't even tell the players after the game that, "Hey, this was my last game." As he told me when I talked with him, he just walked to the other end of the arena and started crying. So they were 2-7 at that point. They come home. There's a break in the schedule, and that's when he hires Slick Leonard. Slick had, as I mentioned, helped direct that open tryout in June of '67, and he was supposedly a scout for the team. I don't think it was a paid position, but he would be at games occasionally. He had interest. He had coached the Baltimore Bullets and been let go in 1964, was living in Kokomo, Indiana, about an hour north, and selling graduation supplies for a company called Herff Jones, selling class rings and graduation supplies, invitations, that kind of thing. He wasn't going to give up that job to coach in the ABA when it was formed. And I think they were leery of him because he had a reputation as kind of a wild man. But after Slick saw the team that first year, and after they acquired Mel Daniels, he realized this team's got some talent. They could win. And he realized that, look, I could coach this team as kind of a sideline activity. I don't have to give up my job with Herff Jones. We will practice at night. I'll drive down from Kokomo for practice. My wife can help me with my job, and I could kind of maintain my sales job and still coach this professional basketball team. So he kept both jobs, and he gradually turned it around. He took over when they were 2-7. They started 1-7, but they were 2-7 when he took over, and gradually changed the culture of that team. And by the end of that year, they were in the ABA finals.
How long did he keep that dual job thing going? I mean, it couldn't have lasted long given that success that he ultimately had by the end of the season.
He kept it a few more years. He did. He would sometimes have meetings with clients like in a restaurant near the Coliseum before the game, or he would, give tickets away to school principals or people like that who he needed to sell to and kind of to conduct his business around the games. The fact he was the Pacers coach just enhanced his image and name around the state. I think he hired people to make some of the calls for him, calling the school. he would close the deal. His wife, Nancy, who's just a great administrator and a sharp businesswoman, kind of organized it for them behind the scenes, and their kids would sit on the living room floor and package the things they were mailing out, the graduation supplies they were mailing out, kind of became a family operation. So he actually hung on to that Herff Jones deal for a few years after he became the coach.
Well, look, this is a guy who stuck with the franchise not only for the rest of the ABA run, but also a bit into its run in the NBA, and is obviously still very involved with the Pacers. I believe he still calls maybe not all the games, but is a broadcast color man for the Pacer local broadcasts, and was inducted in the Hall of Fame himself in 2014. So, this all sounds like these are two seasons, and we're maybe can corral this at the end of the second season. I mean, they made it all the way to the championship series, and it seems like even though despite losing to the Pat Boone-owned Oakland Oaks, that had really turned it around themselves that season, it really seemed like this team was either by luck or happenstance or hard work or maybe a combination of all those things, really on a solid footing, perhaps more than any other ABA franchise, and set for success for however long the ABA lasted, and maybe elsewhere as it ultimately became.
Yes, and you're right. It was a combination of hard work, dedication, and luck. Just the dumb luck of getting Roger Brown, of getting Mel Daniels, of getting Slick Leonard, up the road in Kokomo to coach the team. It was very fortunate that all this came together, but it also took a lot of hard work and a lot of dedication from the ownership group, who never did make money on the franchise. So, and the Pacers kind of propped up the entire ABA because of the fan interest. This is the city that drew the best. Players wanted to play here, and players look forward to coming here to play. The Pacers, in fact, hosted some doubleheaders where a team from another city, like Houston, would give up a home game to come play here as part of a doubleheader because they'd make more money doing that, taking a share of the gate. So they kind of propped up the entire league, and by their success that, they got on national television, that kind of thing. So, the Pacers were lucky to survive themselves, and by their survival, the ABA was able to survive for a while.
And, of course, a bunch of ABA championships and all of that. I don't want to gloss over the rest of their history, but obviously your book, called Reborn, The Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis, it does spend most of its time focused on those first two arguably seminal years, but perhaps you could give some insight into the rest of the story, I guess, in terms of the city of Indianapolis, its sort of budding and growing, I guess, professional stature, and ultimately what became a more solidified love affair with the Pacers, and frankly, even to the point of helping a bit of downtown Indianapolis when it came to a new arena, and sort of doubling down on that love affair and that belief in this team. For the betterment of the city.
Yeah, no question. The success of the Pacers brought the city together in a lot of ways. The only thing going on that brought together people of different ethnic backgrounds, different financial status, rich people, poor people. The top ticket for the Pacers when they began was $4. It was $4, $3, $2, and $1.50. You get into a game for $1.50. And so, anybody with a job basically could afford to go to games. And that it brought the city together, created a lot of excitement because they were good. They started winning championships. Their first championship was 1970. And they won again in 72 and 73. And it really was a sensation, all the baby boomers like myself are in high school, college, then they're really excited about this team and this league and the style of basketball play. And it became pretty apparent that, look, the Fairgrounds Coliseum isn't an adequate facility. They need to get something better. It was really big enough. Some people will tell you, the Pacers sold out every game. Well, no, they didn't. The Coliseum sat something like 9,100 people for capacity. The Pacers never averaged more than about 7,100 fans per game, but they would sell out playoff games and the bigger regular season games. So, there was a real need for a new arena. And Richard Lugar, who's now a retired senator, was the mayor of Indianapolis at that time. And there were some people were trying to talk about building an arena out in the suburbs, that kind of thing. And he finally stepped in and said, no, we're going to do this downtown. And he spearheaded the effort, and they built Market Square Arena downtown, which opened in 1974. 74, 75 was the first season of Market Square. And that revitalized downtown. I grew up here, and as a kid, it was fun, exciting to go downtown and go shopping and so forth. But as shopping malls opened around the city, here like they did everywhere else in the country, in the early to mid 60s, downtown was dying. And there was hardly any reason to go downtown unless you happened to work there. So the building of Market Square Arena began a revitalization trend in downtown Indianapolis and led to other things. And you could argue that, would the Colts be here if not for the Pacers' success downtown in the NBA? The Colts come in 1984. Indianapolis had kind of proven itself as a major league sports city. And downtown Indianapolis today, frankly, is doing great. There's all kinds of things going on. The Pacers are in a new facility, Bankers Life Fieldhouse, but they played at Market Square from 1974 up until 1999, and it was a great home, and a lot of great moments happened there too. So, if not for the success of the ABA Pacers, downtown Indianapolis is probably not what it is today.
At some point, maybe we can go a little deeper into the rest of the years of this franchise. But I guess my last general question around this, and again, the book is called Reborn: The Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis, and it's a very deep and well researched read about sort of the first two seasons and what became of those seasons afterwards, and obviously the beginnings of basketball coming back to Indianapolis and Indiana professionally prior to that. What did you learn from this exercise that maybe you didn't know about before? Was there something about this team that you thought you knew, even as a beat writer, that as you went back and learned and uncovered some things that perhaps either took you by surprise, or maybe you didn't know, or maybe looked now at the team today in a new light because of the reach back into history?
Yeah, I would say, I knew a lot of the stories and the personalities just because I had met them along the way. But probably the thing that impressed me most was that the original ownership group deserve a lot of credit and don't get enough credit, because they were truly doing this just for the benefit of the city. They weren't hoping, I don't think any of them thought they were going to get rich off of this. They might have been hoping for that merger and it become a good investment, but they were going into it fully prepared to lose money and just wanted to take a chance on this Indianapolis franchise surviving and staying in Indianapolis. They were wanting the city to become a better place. There was an organization called the Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee, Greater Indianapolis Progress Committee. They called it GYPSY as the acronym. And a lot of local leaders were trying to make the city a better place. And part of that effort was to get a major league franchise of some kind. And once the Pacers were formed, some people came together and kicked in $5,000, $10,000 here, $20,000 there to finance the thing, and they never did make money. They wound up having to sell it to another group. The people I've talked with say they lost between $20,000 and $30,000 on it. They're not bitter about it. They're just proud of the fact that they helped the Pacers get off the ground. So, in my mind, a really impressive effort on their part, an altruistic effort just to try to get something major league for Indianapolis to have, and to be perhaps the engine for growth in other areas as well.
See, that's very interesting, and I wonder too, as people go to today's games, and obviously in the gigantic business that the Pacers and the NBA and professional basketball are today, how much knowledge there is sort of those civic shoulders, shall we say, that sort of created and boosted this team and this sort of fledgling little American Basketball Association into not only a thriving team in the NBA, but also a major contribution to the welfare of not only downtown Indianapolis, but the metropolitan area and arguably the state. I'm just curious as to how much throwback there is, or how much true, deference or memory there is of some of those early days and those foundational building blocks, or is that sort of a lost thing in the community these days, given the modern era?
I think it's kind of lost. Hopefully my book, gives credit to those people and recognizes what they accomplished. But certainly most people here aren't aware of who those original investors were. They all had, real jobs. They were bankers or attorneys, that type of thing, who were just kind of kicking money in here and there. John DeVoe, who was probably the most involved member of the founding group, he died at a Pacer game the second year of the franchise. He was an insurance executive. His wife, who is still alive, told me, he made about $40,000 a year salary at the time, which was a lot, which is, more than the players were making, certainly. But he, wasn't trying to get rich off of the Pacers. He was trying to get it going so he could back out of it and go back to his real job. He didn't want to spend his life going to basketball games. But he was kind of typical of the selfless effort of these original investors. So they do not get enough credit. Because there wasn't one guy, today we can focus on the Simon brothers and Herb Simon. They saved the franchise in 1983. It's a group of investors who kind of came and went. Some were involved for a year or two. Some came in later. It's difficult to recognize them as a body because it was kind of evolving and, people coming and going. And three of them were in Lafayette, Indiana, for that matter. So for those reasons, they really haven't gotten enough credit. The Pacers last year in their 50th season were recognizing their history, and they were having decade nights. And they had a 60s night where they brought back Mike Storin, the first GM, the players from those teams in the 60s, and, they invited the few remaining members of the original group, and one of them was able to go, but he's not in very good health, and another one had a conflict and couldn't go. So, these people are mostly gone now, and it's not in a position to be recognized. So I hope my book accomplished that. I hope it points out who these people were and what they were able to contribute to the Pacers and indirectly to the city.
All right, there you go. There's our conversation with Mark Montieth. And before you have a conniption and you can stop yelling at your devices, yes, we do know that there were years of ABA funness from the Indiana Pacers that we did not get to, and we will get to that, as well as maybe their first year or two segueing into the NBA. We're going to have Mark back. We're in the efforts now to get him back on the show to talk about the rest of those years at least. We wanted to kind of focus specifically on those first 2 years and the prelude to the ABA's founding and the Pacers launch in those first 2 years. Largely because Mark's book is primarily focused on that little mini era of such. The book, again, is called Reborn, The Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis. It is published by Half Court Press. It came out in October. It is a fun read. It's deep. It's got some great pictures in there and some great writing and some great interviews. And again, it's the first 2 years or so of the franchise, but we will have Mark back to talk about the rest of the story in a future episode. So keep a listen out for that. But in the interim, your homework assignment, of course, is to read and memorize as much text as possible from the book Reborn. You can find a link to Reborn on our website. That's goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search for episode number 41. Mark Montieth. You will see a link to the book and as well as more background about our show, about the episode he's trying to say, as well as some fun photos and all that kind of stuff. You can also check out the book or buy it on Mark's website as well as all his other creative endeavors and other books and stuff. And that's at markmontieth.com. That's Mark with a K. Montieth is Montieth, markmontieth.com. And again, we thank Mark, and we look forward to having him back very soon here on this little podcast to complete, hopefully, the initial story of the Pacers and their ABA/early NBA days. For us, we want to thank, of course, Podfly Productions, and in particular, our friend Jerry Payne, who went completely beyond the call of duty the last 2 weeks in the midst of a major, at least for Atlanta, snowstorm, and learned the finer arts of snow shoveling in the process. So we thank him for going out of his way and digging his way out and getting our show out and into the ether for the last 2 weeks. And, not much sympathy from somebody here in the Chicago metro area when it comes to snow, but, it's a rare occurrence down there. And we thank Jerry for going that extra mile. We appreciate it immensely. And we also appreciate Podfly and what he and his friends do down there. That's podfly.net, Podfly, podfly.net. If you're thinking about podcasting, if you're curious about it, want to get started, there is no better place than Podfly Productions to get going. So give them a try if you're considering such. Let's see. For us, goodseatsstillavailable.com is our website, as we said, and that's where all our social links are found, too. You will find our email address. You can send us email there, as well as all that other fun stuff I mentioned earlier. On Twitter, find us at Good Seats Still. Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. There's a Facebook page devoted to us as well. You can like us there. And while you're liking us, by all means, continue that liking and loving by rating and reviewing wherever you can, wherever you download the show, wherever you subscribe to it. If there's an opportunity to kind of put a couple of words of goodness there in the review section, by all means do it. It helps the algorithm for the show. It gets other people perhaps like you to potentially consider the show. And it's all good heat for growing our audience, which is now in the tens of thousands, I'm happy to report. And we thank each and every one of you for going deep with us each week. All right, until next week, take care. Thanks for listening, as always. And we'll see you soon.